There is a particular kind of silence that follows the shattering of a life, a hush that settles over the wreckage like snow upon a battlefield, and Eleanor Weston had learned to inhabit that silence with the same quiet dignity with which she had once inhabited ballrooms and drawing-rooms, and the bright, glittering promise of a future that now seemed to belong to another woman entirely. She sat in the cramped drawing-room of their rented townhouse, a modest dwelling in an unfashionable corner of London, where the streets were narrow and the neighbours respectable but struggling, and she listened to the cold autumn rain lash against the windows with a fury that seemed almost personal, as though the heavens themselves had decided to mirror the tempest that had raged within her for 3 long years. Through the thin walls she could hear her father's laboured breathing, each ragged inhale a reminder of the physician's bills they could not pay, and the medicine that grew more expensive with each passing month, and she pressed her fingertips briefly to her sternum, just above her heart, holding herself together through force of will alone, as she had learned to do in the terrible weeks after Theodore Pemberton had looked at her with those pale blue eyes, and told her she had been nothing more than a pleasant diversion. The letter in her lap bore the landlord's seal, and she did not need to read it again to know its contents, for the words had already carved themselves into her memory with the precision of a surgeon's blade. They would no longer extend credit. They required payment in full within the month, and if such payment was not forthcoming, alternative arrangements would need to be made. Alternative arrangements, Eleanor thought with a bitter twist of her lips. Such a civilized phrase for the workhouse, for the slow dissolution of everything her father had built and everything her mother had loved, for the final extinguishing of a family that had once known comfort and hope, and the simple pleasure of white camellias blooming in a modest garden. She looked down at her hands, still elegant, despite the roughness that had come from economies she had never imagined making, and she thought of her mother's locket resting against her collarbone, and the worn volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry tucked safely in her bedchamber, the only treasures she had refused to sell because some things were worth more than the coins they might bring. Some things were all that remained of love, in a world that had taught her love was merely a pretty word men used when circumstances permitted. "I have learned not to expect," she began, the thought forming with the weariness of long practice, and then she stopped herself, because expecting nothing was its own form of protection, a fortress she had built around her heart with stones of disappointment and mortar of resignation. But fortresses required maintenance, and hers was crumbling, and as she listened to the storm, rage outside, and her father struggle for breath in the next room, Eleanor made a decision with the same desperate determination that had carried her through 3 years of whispers and pitying glances and the slow erosion of everything she had once believed possible. Tomorrow she would call upon Mr. Samuel Aldridge, her father's former business associate, and she would ask if there was any position, any respectable work, anything at all that might keep them from the abyss yawning at their feet. And she would not let pride stand between her father and survival, because pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and she would do whatever she must. The morning brought no relief from the rain, only a grey and relentless continuation of the storm that had lashed her windows through the night, and Eleanor dressed with trembling fingers in her most presentable gown, a dove-grey muslin that had seen better days, but still retained enough dignity to pass muster in a respectable office. Before making her way through streets slick with mud and misery to the modest premises where Mr. Samuel Aldridge conducted his business affairs. She had rehearsed her words a dozen times during the sleepless hours, had practiced the careful balance between honest desperation and maintained dignity that she hoped would move him to compassion, without inspiring pity. And yet, when she sat across from him in his small but tidy office, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she did not remember accepting, she found that all her careful phrases had deserted her, and left only the raw truth of her circumstances. Mr. Aldridge was a kind man, with thoughtful brown eyes, and the sort of quiet competence that inspired trust. And he listened to her halting explanation with genuine sympathy etched across his features, nodding occasionally and never once allowing his expression to shift into the condescension she had dreaded. When she finished speaking, her voice steady only through supreme effort, he was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor felt her heart sink into the worn leather of her shoes, because she recognized that silence, had heard it from creditors and landlords and former friends who had nothing to offer but their regret. But then Mr. Aldridge leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and said something that made no sense at all. Something about his employer, the Duke of Thornwood, and a most unusual situation, and Eleanor's hands began to tremble so violently that she was forced to set down her teacup before she shattered it against the saucer. He explained it carefully, methodically, as though he understood that she would need to hear the words several times before they could penetrate the fog of her disbelief. The Duke required a wife, not for love. He was quite clear on this point, his voice gentle but firm, but for practical considerations of duty and dynasty, and he sought a woman of good family and sensible temperament who would not expect romantic attachment in return for the security and comfort he could provide. "He is not a warm man, Miss Weston," Mr. Aldridge said, meeting her eyes with an earnestness that seemed almost like a warning. "But he is honourable, and in all my years of service I have never known him to break his word or treat anyone with cruelty." Eleanor heard herself asking questions, practical questions about her father's care, about expectations, about the terms of such an arrangement. And all the while some distant part of her mind was screaming that this was madness, that she was contemplating selling herself to a stranger for shelter from the storm that had battered her life for 3 long years. And yet another part, the part that remembered her father's laboured breathing and the landlord's letter, and the empty place where hope used to live, was already calculating, already surrendering. She thought of Theodore's pale blue eyes and the way he had smiled while destroying her, and she made herself a promise, silent and fierce, pressing her fingertips briefly to her sternum, as though sealing a vow against her own treacherous heart. "I will not hope for love. I will not be foolish again. I will be grateful for safety and respect, and I will not ask for more. I will not give this man or any man the power to destroy me as Theodore did." And so when Mr. Aldridge offered her his carriage, when he explained that the Duke wished to meet her today, this very afternoon, Eleanor Weston drew a breath that tasted of rain and resignation, and said yes. The carriage that bore her to Mayfair was finer than anything she had ridden in for years, and the rain soaked through her worn pelisse as she stepped down before the imposing facade of Ashworth House. And she thought with bitter clarity that this was fitting, that she was about to sell herself for shelter from the very storm that now plastered her hair to her cheeks and made her shiver beneath fabric too thin for the season. She lifted her chin and squared her shoulders and prepared to meet her fate, and it was only as she climbed the steps that she glanced upward and saw him, a tall, dark figure watching from an upper window, his features obscured by rain and distance, but his presence somehow filling the grey afternoon with a weight she could not name, and something in Eleanor's chest tightened with an emotion she refused to call fear, refused to call hope, refused to call anything at all. The drawing-room of Ashworth House was everything Eleanor's current circumstances were not. Spacious and warm, filled with the soft glow of candlelight despite the grey morning pressing against the tall windows, furnished with pieces that spoke of generations of wealth so secure it need not announce itself, and she stood just inside the doorway, with her rain-dampened pelisse clinging to her shoulders, and her heart beating so loudly she was certain the elegant woman rising from the settee must hear it. Lady Marguerite Ashworth was not at all what Eleanor had expected of a duke's aunt. She was small and round and dressed in a shade of violet that should have clashed with her silver hair, but somehow did not, and her eyes, sharp and knowing beneath their cheerful crinkles, swept over Eleanor with an assessment that missed nothing, not the mended hem of her gown, nor the proud lift of her chin, nor the way her hands remained perfectly still at her sides through sheer force of will. "My dear girl, you are absolutely soaked through. Come and sit by the fire at once. I cannot have my nephew's prospective bride catching her death before we have even had a proper conversation," Lady Marguerite said. And before Eleanor could formulate a response, she found herself guided to a chair near the hearth, a cup of tea pressed into her hands, and a warm shawl draped across her shoulders, all accomplished with such brisk efficiency that she could only blink and murmur her thanks. She had barely taken her first sip when the door opened again, and the temperature of the room seemed to shift, not growing colder precisely, but somehow more charged, as though lightning had entered in the shape of a man, and Eleanor looked up to find the Duke of Thornwood standing in the doorway, and every thought in her head scattered like startled birds. He was nothing like Theodore, nothing at all. And this was the first coherent observation she managed to form as he crossed the room with movements so controlled and economical they seemed almost predatory. Where Theodore had been golden and charming with features designed to please, this man was dark and severe, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite by a sculptor who did not believe in softness. His eyes found hers immediately, dark blue, nearly black in the grey morning light, assessing her with an unnerving directness that made her feel like a horse at auction, and Eleanor felt her spine straighten of its own accord, her chin lifting in a refusal to cower that was as instinctive as breathing. Something flickered in those midnight eyes, too quickly to name, and she watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly when she did not look away. "Miss Weston," he said, and his voice was exactly as Mr. Aldridge had warned her it would be, deep as distant thunder, clipped and cold enough to freeze the tea in her cup. I trust Aldridge explained the nature of this meeting. It was not a question, and Eleanor found herself appreciating the lack of pretense, even as it stung. He did not waste words on pleasantries, did not pretend this was a social call, did not insult her intelligence by suggesting there was anything romantic about a duke summoning a ruined merchant's daughter to discuss marriage. "He did, Your Grace," she replied, and was quietly proud that her voice emerged steady, measured, the melodic formality she had learned in better days serving her well now. He moved closer, gesturing for her to remain seated when she began to rise, and as he passed her chair to take a position by the fireplace, she caught his scent, sandalwood and cedar with an undertone of leather, and it was unexpectedly pleasant, warm and masculine, and nothing like the cloying cologne Theodore had favoured. "Then I shall be direct," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames rather than on her, and she wondered if he found this as uncomfortable as she did, if beneath that granite exterior there was anything that could be called uncertainty. "I require a wife. I have no interest in love, no patience for the scheming machinations of debutantes seeking a title, and no desire to spend another season fending off ambitious mothers and their simpering daughters. I require a woman of good family and sensible temperament who understands that this would be an arrangement of mutual benefit rather than a romantic attachment." He turned then, those dark blue eyes meeting hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she saw Lady Marguerite watching them both with an expression of barely concealed fascination. "I will not pretend to offer you love, Miss Weston," he continued, and his voice dropped lower, rough with something she could not name. "I am not capable of it, but I can offer you honesty, protection, and respect. I can offer complete financial support for your father's care, a comfortable life, and the protection of my name. For some, that is enough." Eleanor sat very still, her fingertips pressed unconsciously to her sternum, and she thought of Theodore's pretty lies and honeyed promises, thought of how he had made her believe she was cherished, only to reveal that she had been nothing more than a pleasant diversion. and she found that this man's brutal honesty was more refreshing than any flattery could have been. "I would ask for 3 days to consider, Your Grace," she said, and watched something that might have been surprise flicker across his severe features. Perhaps he had expected her to accept immediately, desperately, as a drowning woman grasps at any hand extended toward her. "Granted," he said after a moment, and she thought she detected a note of something almost like respect in his voice. As she rose to leave, Lady Marguerite caught her arm in the doorway, and the older woman's voice was soft but urgent. "Do not let his coldness frighten you, child. There is more to my nephew than he allows the world to see." Eleanor carried those words home with her through the rain, sat beside her sleeping father as the afternoon faded into evening, and wrote her acceptance by candlelight before she could convince herself to be afraid. The church was small and quiet, tucked away on a grey London street where the autumn morning light filtered weakly through windows of plain glass, and Eleanor stood in the vestibule with her hands clasped before her, and her heart beating a rhythm that felt less like anticipation than like the measured steps of a prisoner approaching a fate she had chosen but could not quite believe was real. Her gown was simple cream muslin, finer than anything she had worn in 3 years, but modest by the standards of a duchess, and in her hand she held a bouquet of white camellias that had been waiting for her when she arrived, their delicate petals so perfect they seemed almost unreal, and she had not thought to wonder who had chosen them or why they made her throat tighten with an emotion she could not name. Her father was not there. He was too ill to leave his bed, though the nurse Henry had arranged was already installed in their lodgings, and the medicines that had been beyond their reach were now administered with clockwork regularity. And Eleanor felt his absence like a wound, even as she told herself that his comfort mattered more than his presence, that she was doing this for him, that everything she was about to promise was a price worth paying for his care. Lady Marguerite stood nearby, resplendent in lavender silk, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like hope, and Mr. Aldridge waited near the altar with the quiet competence that seemed to define him, and there were a handful of other witnesses, whose names Eleanor did not know, and whose faces she would not remember. And then the doors opened, and Henry entered, and everything else fell away. He wore black, severe and immaculate, and his dark hair was brushed back from a face that revealed nothing of whatever he might be feeling, and Eleanor watched him walk toward the altar with that controlled economy of movement that made him seem like a force of nature contained in human form. And she thought again how utterly unlike Theodore he was, how there was nothing pretty or charming about him, nothing designed to please, only this stark and uncompromising presence that filled the small church as though the walls had contracted around him. She walked toward him on legs that felt distant from her body, and when she reached his side she caught his scent, sandalwood and cedar and leather, and it steadied her somehow, grounded her in the reality of this moment, even as that reality seemed impossible. The ceremony itself passed in fragments she would later struggle to reassemble. The vicar's voice, thin and reedy in the quiet space. The weight of the ring as Henry slid it onto her finger, his hand steady but marked by a slight tremor she did not understand. The words she spoke, traditional vows that tasted strange on her tongue because she meant them, and did not mean them, because she was promising forever to a man she barely knew for reasons that had nothing to do with love. And then Henry spoke his vows, the traditional words first, his deep voice resonant in the small space, and Eleanor listened with the distant attention of someone who has already accepted her fate, until he added something that was not in the ceremony, something that made her breath catch and her eyes fly to his face. "I vow to you," he said, and his voice dropped lower, rough with an intensity that seemed to surprise even him, "that you will never again be made to feel less than you are, not by anyone, not while I draw breath." Eleanor stared at him, searching his features for some explanation, some indication of why he would make such a promise to a woman he had married for convenience. But his expression remained unreadable, his dark blue eyes giving nothing away, and she was left with only the echo of his words and the strange, fierce way he had spoken them. The journey to Thornwood Manor took several hours, and they travelled in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but rather felt like the hush between movements of a symphony, weighted with significance Eleanor could not yet interpret. Henry pointed out landmarks as they entered his lands, an ancient oak where he had climbed as a boy, a tenant farm that had been in the same family for 5 generations, a stream where he had learned to fish, and Eleanor listened and watched the countryside roll past the carriage windows, green and gold and grey under the autumn sky, and felt something loosening in her chest that she had not realized was clenched. She was safe. Whatever else this marriage was or was not, whatever coldness or distance lay ahead, she was safe, and her father was cared for, and she would never again have to count candle stubs or choose between medicine and bread. Thornwood Manor itself rose from the landscape like something from a dream, grey stone softened by climbing roses that still held a few late blooms, surrounded by ancient oaks whose leaves were turning gold, and Eleanor pressed her fingertips briefly to her sternum as the carriage approached, because the beauty of it threatened to overwhelm her, this place that was now her home, this life that was now hers. The household staff lined up in the entrance hall to greet their new duchess, a sea of curious faces that Eleanor tried to memorize, even as exhaustion began to pull at her edges, and among them stood Mrs. Beckett, the housekeeper, whose shrewd eyes assessed Eleanor with an intensity that felt like judgment, and Eleanor lifted her chin and met that gaze without flinching, because she had learned that showing weakness invited cruelty, and she would not begin her new life by cowering. That night, alone in a bedchamber grander than any room she had occupied in years, Eleanor lay awake and listened to the storm that had broken over Thornwood, thunder rattling the windows, and lightning illuminating the unfamiliar shapes of furniture that was now hers. And she thought about Henry's vow and the tremor in his hands, and the way he had spoken of his lands with something almost like tenderness, and she pressed her mother's locket against her chest, and wondered what she had married, what manner of man lived behind that granite facade. Somewhere in the house, she heard movement, footsteps, restless, pacing, and she knew without knowing how she knew that it was Henry, awake as she was awake, weathering the storm in his own solitude, and she did not go to him, did not know if such a thing would be welcome or even appropriate. But she wondered, and wondering, felt like the first crack in the walls she had built around her heart. The first fortnight of Eleanor's marriage passed in a strange suspension between the life she had known and the life she was learning to inhabit, and she found herself moving through the grand rooms of Thornwood Manor with the cautious wonder of a traveller in an unfamiliar country, noting the customs and rhythms of this new world, while never quite forgetting that she was, in some essential way, a visitor who had been granted permanent residence through circumstances rather than belonging. Henry was often absent during the days, occupied with estate business that took him to tenant farms and distant corners of his lands. But when they did encounter one another, at breakfast, where he read correspondence while she sipped tea and watched the morning light move across the polished table, at dinner, where they sat at opposite ends of a table that could seat 20 and spoke of neutral subjects in voices that echoed slightly in the candle-lit vastness, he was unfailingly courteous, inquiring after her comfort, ensuring she had everything she required, treating her with a formal consideration that was nothing like Theodore's practiced charm, and yet somehow more reassuring for its very lack of pretense. Lady Marguerite had become a warm and welcome companion, filling the hours with cheerful conversation and gentle guidance about the household. And it was during one of these conversations, as they sat together in Eleanor's private sitting-room with needlework neither of them was particularly attending to, that Eleanor found herself speaking of her mother for the first time since arriving at Thornwood. She had a garden, Eleanor said, her fingers stilling on the embroidery she had been pretending to work, her grey eyes distant with memory. Nothing grand. Just a small plot behind our house in the years before my father's business grew, and she grew white camellias there. They were her favourites. She said they reminded her of her own mother, and I used to sit among them as a child and feel as though nothing in the world could ever go wrong. She did not notice the knowing smile that curved Lady Marguerite's lips, nor the thoughtful way the older woman tucked this information away like a seed planted for future blooming, and the conversation moved on to other things, leaving the camellias behind like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading unseen. But it was the Hartwell ball that tested Eleanor's fragile equilibrium, the Hartwell ball that forced her to confront the ghost of her former life in a setting that held nothing but painful memories, and as she dressed for the evening in a gown of deep blue silk that Henry had insisted she order from the finest modiste in London. "You are the Duchess of Thornwood now, and you will dress accordingly," he had said, in that clipped way of his that brooked no argument. She felt her hands begin to tremble with a fear she could not entirely suppress. This was the same ballroom where Theodore had destroyed her 3 years ago, the same glittering space where she had learned that love was a lie, and that she had been nothing more than a pleasant diversion. And though she was returning now as a duchess rather than a disgraced merchant's daughter, the old wound throbbed beneath the new finery like a bruise that had never fully healed. In the carriage, her trembling worsened despite her best efforts to still it, and she clasped her gloved hands tightly in her lap and stared at the passing streets, and told herself that she was being foolish, that she was safe now, that no one could hurt her any more. But her body remembered what her mind tried to forget, and the shaking would not stop. "I am not usually so foolish," she whispered, mortified by her own weakness, unable to look at the man seated across from her in the shadows of the carriage. Henry did not respond immediately, and she thought perhaps he had not heard, or perhaps he was disgusted by her cowardice. But then she felt something unexpected. His hand, bare and warm, reaching across the space between them to cover her gloved fingers where they twisted in her lap. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He simply held her hand with a steady pressure that seemed to say without words that he understood, that he was there, that she was not alone. And the warmth of his touch spread through her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, loosening something in her chest that she had not known was clenched. "You are not foolish," he said finally, his voice low in the darkness, his gaze still fixed on the window. "You are brave. There is a difference." He did not release her hand for the remainder of the journey, and when the carriage finally stopped before the blazing lights of the Hartwell residence, he withdrew his touch only as the footman opened the door, and neither of them spoke of it. But Eleanor felt the ghost of his warmth on her fingers as she placed her hand on his arm and allowed him to lead her into the ballroom where she had once been broken. The whispers began immediately, as she had known they would. The Duchess of Thornwood, can you imagine? That Western girl who was so thoroughly ruined, however did she manage it? But Eleanor kept her chin high and her spine straight, and reminded herself that she had survived worse than whispers, that she had weathered a storm that would have destroyed lesser women, and that she would not crumble now. She saw Theodore almost immediately, standing near the refreshment table with Arabella on his arm, and the sight of him sent a jolt through her chest that was equal parts pain and something she could not quite name. He looked older than she remembered, his golden handsomeness grown brittle around the edges, and Arabella beside him was overdressed and petulant, her pretty face marred by a permanent expression of dissatisfaction. Theodore's pale blue eyes found Eleanor across the crowded room, and she watched them widen with surprise as he registered her elevated status, the fine gown, the sapphire earrings that had been waiting in her jewelry box when she arrived at Thornwood, the unmistakable air of a woman who had risen rather than fallen, and then those eyes narrowed with something calculating, something that made her stomach clench with remembered dread. But before Theodore could move, before he could approach and shatter her fragile composure with whatever cruelty he was surely planning, Henry appeared at her side like a shadow given form, his presence solid and immovable, and his hand settled at the small of her back with a possessiveness that sent heat blooming through her, despite the layers of silk and whalebone between his palm and her skin. Theodore stopped. His calculating expression flickered, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty, and then he turned away, steering Arabella toward the opposite side of the room, and Eleanor released a breath she had not known she was holding. "Thank you," she murmured, too quietly for anyone else to hear, and Henry's hand pressed slightly firmer against her back, a response that required no words, and she thought, with a confusion that was not entirely unpleasant, that she did not know what to make of this man who had married her for convenience and yet defended her as though she mattered, who claimed to be incapable of love and yet touched her with a gentleness that made her heart do strange and unexpected things in her chest. The library at Thornwood Manor was a sanctuary Eleanor had not known she needed, until she discovered it on a grey afternoon when the winter light filtered weakly through tall windows, and the rest of the house seemed too vast and too quiet for her restless spirit. And she had wandered through corridors. She was still learning to navigate until she pushed open a heavy oak door and found herself standing at the threshold of a room that seemed to have been waiting for her all along. Its walls lined floor to ceiling with books whose spines gleamed with the soft patina of age and use, its air carrying the scent of leather and paper, and something faintly sweet that might have been beeswax from the candles that stood ready in their holders. And she had pressed her fingertips to her sternum, without realizing she was doing it, because the beauty of the space threatened to overwhelm her in ways she could not entirely explain. She spent hours that first day simply wandering the shelves, trailing her fingers along spines, pulling volumes at random to examine their contents. And it was on a lower shelf, tucked between treatises on agricultural management and a history of the Roman Empire, that she found a well-worn copy of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese, the same edition her mother had given her years ago, and when she opened it with trembling hands, she discovered marginalia in a masculine script that she recognized from estate documents as Henry's own hand, observations and questions written in the margins of poems about love and devotion. And she stood there holding the book as though it were something fragile and precious, because she had not expected this, had not imagined that the cold and practical Duke of Thornwood would read poetry, would engage with it deeply enough to write his thoughts in the margins, would keep such a volume where anyone might find it. She retrieved her own copy of Browning from her chambers and settled into a chair by the window, losing herself in the familiar verses, and she did not know how much time had passed when she became aware of a presence in the doorway and looked up to find Henry standing there, his dark blue eyes fixed upon her with an expression that shifted and softened for just a moment before his customary reserve returned like a door closing. He asked what she was reading, and she showed him, and he nodded and said only, "A worthy choice." But he did not leave as she expected him to. Instead, he crossed to the chair across from hers and settled into it with a sheaf of estate papers, and they spent the remainder of the afternoon in a silence that felt less like absence than like presence, like two people occupying the same space without need for words to justify their proximity. And Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him over the top of her book, watching the way the winter light caught the planes of his face, the way his brow furrowed slightly as he read, the way his hands moved with careful precision as he made notes in the margins of his documents. That evening, after dinner, Lady Marguerite found Eleanor alone in the morning room and settled beside her with the air of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to speak. "Mark my words, child," the older woman said, her shrewd eyes warm with something that looked almost like affection. "Before the year is out, my nephew will speak words he has never spoken to anyone, and he does not know it yet. But I have watched him for 30 years, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. And he will break before he bends, that boy. But you, my dear, might just be the one to teach him that breaking is not the same as weakness." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to deflect, to say that Lady Marguerite was mistaken, but the words would not come, and she was left with only the echo of the prediction and the memory of Henry's expression softening in the library doorway, and she pressed her fingers to her sternum, and wondered if perhaps, despite everything she had promised herself, hope was already taking root in the spaces she had thought were sealed forever. The stables at Thornwood Manor smelled of sweet hay and warm horseflesh, and the particular clean scent of well-maintained leather, and Eleanor found herself drawn there on a crisp autumn morning when the frost still clung to the grass, and her breath made small clouds in the air, drawn by a longing she had not permitted herself to feel in years. The longing to ride, to feel the power of a horse beneath her, to remember what it had been like before everything fell apart, and such pleasures became impossible luxuries for a girl with empty pockets and a dying father. The stable-master, a weathered man named Mr. Fenton, who had served the Ashworth family for 3 decades, showed her the horses with obvious pride, pointing out the fine hunters and the elegant carriage horses, and the sturdy ponies kept for the tenants' children to learn upon. And Eleanor listened and nodded, and felt something loosening in her chest at the simple beauty of these creatures, at the way they turned their great soft eyes toward her, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who had known loss. It was Mr. Fenton who warned her about Sovereign, gesturing toward a stall at the far end of the stable, where a massive black stallion stood like a shadow-given form, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian, his dark eyes watching everything with an intelligence that seemed almost unsettling. "That one's not to be approached, Your Grace," Mr. Fenton said, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. "Sovereign tolerates no one but the Duke himself, and he's sent more than one stable hand to the surgeon with his temper." Eleanor nodded dutifully, and waited until Mr. Fenton was called away to attend to some matter with the farrier, and then, because she had never been particularly good at following sensible advice when horses were involved, she approached Sovereign's stall with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who understood that trust must be earned in inches rather than demanded in strides. The great beast watched her come, his ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring as he caught her scent, and she stopped just outside his reach and began to speak to him in a voice she would have been mortified for anyone to overhear, a ridiculous, high-pitched, crooning voice that she had used with horses since childhood, the voice that her mother had laughingly called her horse-charming nonsense. "Oh, what a magnificent monster you are," she murmured, her lips curving into a smile she could not suppress. "What a handsome, terrible, clearly superior creature. Yes, you know you are the finest horse in all of England, do you not, you great, beautiful beast?" Sovereign's ears swiveled toward her voice, and something in his posture shifted, softened, and then, impossibly, wonderfully, he lowered his great head and stretched his neck toward her, and Eleanor reached out with trembling fingers to stroke the velvet of his nose, laughing softly at the miracle of it. She was so absorbed in this unexpected communion that she did not hear the footsteps behind her, did not sense the presence in the stable doorway until a sound broke the spell. A laugh, genuine and surprised and warm, a sound she had never heard before, and yet recognized instantly as belonging to her husband. She whirled, her cheeks flushing crimson, her hand flying to her chest in mortification, and found Henry leaning against the stable door with an expression she had never seen on his face. Amusement, yes, but something more, something that made him look years younger and almost boyish. the severe lines of his features softened by genuine mirth. "Magnificent monster," he repeated, and his voice was warm with laughter, and Eleanor wanted to sink into the stable floor and disappear forever. "I was merely, that is to say, I know I should not have," she stammered, but he shook his head, still smiling, and pushed himself off the doorframe to approach her, and she caught the scent of sandalwood and cedar mingling with the hay as he drew near. "He has never let anyone but me touch him," Henry said, and his voice had dropped lower, the laughter fading into something more wondering, more intent. "It seems you have conquered us both." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning she was afraid to examine too closely, and then he cleared his throat, and the moment shifted. "Would you like to ride this morning?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes remained warm. "I could show you the estate properly if you are willing." She was willing, desperately willing, and so she found herself mounted on a lovely grey mare, while Henry rode sovereign beside her, and they spent the morning exploring the rolling hills and ancient woodlands of Thornwood, and Eleanor discovered a Henry she had not known existed, a man who spoke with quiet pride about his tenants' welfare, who knew every farmer by name and every cottage by its history, who pointed out the spot where he had broken his arm falling from a tree as a boy, and the stream where he had learned to fish, and the hill from which one could see 3 counties on a clear day. He was relaxed in a way she had never witnessed, his usual rigid control loosened by the open air and the familiar landscape, and when he laughed again at something she said, a small joke about the mayor's opinion of a particularly muddy patch, Eleanor felt her heart do something unexpected and terrifying in her chest, felt the walls she had so carefully constructed begin to crack, and she thought of Lady Marguerite's words about hidden depths, and wondered if perhaps the older woman had seen what Eleanor was only now beginning to understand, that beneath the ice there was warmth, beneath the silence there was feeling, and that she was in very grave danger of losing her heart to a man who had told her plainly that he had no heart to give in return. The storm came without warning in the deepest hours of the night, and Eleanor woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the countryside like the drums of some approaching army, the windows of her bedchamber rattling in their frames as lightning split the darkness beyond the heavy curtains, and she lay there for a long moment, with her heart pounding against her ribs, transported without her consent to another night 3 years past, when she had sat in the dark of their London townhouse, listening to the rain and to her father's muffled weeping through the thin walls. The night everything had shattered, the night she had learned that storms could destroy more than crops and carriages, that they could level entire lives and leave nothing but wreckage in their wake. She could not stay in bed, could not lie still while the thunder crashed and the memories pressed against her chest like stones, and so she wrapped herself in the soft wool shawl that had been her mother's, and slipped from her chamber into the darkened corridor, her bare feet silent on the cold floors as she made her way through the sleeping house toward the library, toward the only sanctuary she had found in this strange new life, toward books and quiet, and the faint, lingering scent of leather and beeswax that had come to mean safety in ways she did not wish to examine too closely. The library door stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of candlelight spilling into the hallway, and Eleanor paused with her hand upon the wood, some instinct warning her that she was not the only restless soul abroad this night. And when she pushed the door open and stepped inside, she found Henry standing at the tall windows with his back to the room, his broad shoulders rigid beneath the white linen of his shirt, his hands clenched at his sides as he watched the lightning tear the sky apart beyond the rain-lashed glass. He did not hear her enter, so fixed was his attention upon the storm, and she stood frozen in the doorway, watching as a particularly violent crack of thunder shook the manor to its foundations, and he flinched, visibly flinched, his whole body jerking as though the sound had struck him like a physical blow. And in that moment Eleanor understood with sudden piercing clarity that the formidable Duke of Thornwood, the man whose cold demeanour could silence a ballroom, the man who had faced down Theodore Pemberton without a tremor in his voice, was afraid, genuinely and deeply afraid, of storms. When he finally sensed her presence and turned, his expression shuttered instantly, the vulnerability she had witnessed disappearing behind the familiar mask of reserve. But it was too late. She had already seen, had already been given this glimpse behind the walls he maintained so carefully, and she knew with the same instinct that had guided her through 3 years of hardship that to acknowledge what she had witnessed would be to shame him, would be to violate the fragile trust that had been building between them in library silences and morning rides, and the warm weight of his hand upon hers in a darkened carriage. She did not mention the thunder, did not let her eyes betray that she had seen him flinch, but simply asked in a voice she kept carefully light whether she might sit with him a while, as she found herself unable to sleep. And he nodded stiffly, his jaw tight, and she crossed to her usual chair and settled into it with her worn volume of Browning, opening to a page at random and beginning to read quietly to herself, while the storm raged beyond the windows, and the candles flickered in their holders, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar drifted to her across the space between them. She did not look up as the minutes stretched into an hour, did not watch as his rigid posture slowly eased, as he moved from the window to the chair across from her, as the terrible tension in his shoulders gradually unwound in the presence of her quiet calm. But she was aware of him with every fibre of her being, aware of the way his breathing steadied, aware of the moment when his clenched hands finally relaxed upon the arms of his chair, aware that she was offering him something wordless and precious, a shelter from the storm that had nothing to do with walls or roofs, and everything to do with simply being present, simply being there, asking nothing and giving everything. When she finally raised her eyes from her book, the storm had passed and Henry had fallen asleep in the chair across from her, his dark head tilted back against the leather, his severe features softened by slumber into something younger and almost tender. And Eleanor sat very still, watching him breathe, watching the candlelight play across the planes of his face, feeling something shift and settle in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had thought forever sealed. He woke as the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the windows, his dark blue eyes opening to find her still there, still watching. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, and then he said only, "Thank you," in a voice rough with something more than sleep, something more than gratitude. And Eleanor understood that she had been given something precious indeed, a glimpse of the man behind the mask, a moment of trust from someone who had been taught that trust was weakness. And she pressed her fingertips to her sternum, without realizing she was doing it, and wondered how much longer she could pretend that her heart was not already irrevocably lost. The greenhouse at Thornwood Manor rose from the winter-grey landscape like a jewel box of glass and iron, its panes fogged with warmth against the bitter December morning, and Eleanor found herself drawn to it on a day when the cold had seeped into her very bones, and she longed for something green and growing, something that spoke of life persisting even in the darkest season. And so she wrapped herself in her warmest pelisse, and crossed the frosted grounds with her breath making small clouds before her, and her cheeks stinging with the chill. And when she pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, she was met with a rush of humid air that smelled of earth and growing things and something else, something delicate and hauntingly familiar that she could not immediately place. The head gardener, a weathered man named Mr. Thorne, who had tended the Thornwood grounds for nearly 40 years, greeted her with the careful deference due a duchess and the barely concealed pride of a man showing off his life's work, and he led her through the rows of exotic orchids and climbing jasmine and citrus trees heavy with fruit that had no business existing in an English winter, explaining the heating systems and the careful rotation of plants and the particular challenges of coaxing tropical blooms to thrive so far from their native climes. And Eleanor listened and nodded, and felt the tension in her shoulders easing as the warmth seeped into her bones, felt something loosening in her chest at the simple miracle of green leaves and unfurling petals in the dead of winter. It was when they reached the far corner of the greenhouse, a section set apart from the others by a low iron railing and filled with blooms of purest white, that Mr. Thorne mentioned, almost casually, that His Grace had given very specific instructions about these particular flowers, had been most insistent about the temperature and the soil composition and the precise amount of light they were to receive, and that he had given these instructions months ago, before the wedding in fact, which had struck Mr. Thorne as curious at the time, since His Grace had never before shown much interest in flowers beyond ensuring the grounds were properly maintained. Eleanor stopped walking, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs, because she knew these flowers, knew them with a recognition that went deeper than sight, knew them from the delicate scent that had been teasing at the edges of her awareness since she entered this humid paradise, and she stood frozen at the edge of the iron railing, staring at an entire garden of white camellias blooming impossibly in winter, their petals like carved ivory, their dark, glossy leaves catching the weak light filtering through the glass above. And she remembered mentioning them once, just once, in passing, during those first awkward weeks of her marriage, when she had been telling Lady Marguerite about her mother's garden, and had not even known that Henry was listening from his chair by the fire, had not thought he was paying any attention at all to her quiet reminiscence about the only truly happy time of her childhood. And yet here they were, dozens upon dozens of white camellias, tended with obvious care, grown from nothing in the space of months because he had heard her, because he had remembered, because he had wanted to give her something precious without ever speaking a word about it. She stepped past the railing without conscious thought, moving among the blooms like a woman in a dream, and she reached out with trembling fingers to touch one perfect flower, feeling the cool silk of its petals against her skin, breathing in the scent that transported her instantly to her mother's small garden in the years before everything fell apart, and she felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built so carefully over 3 years of heartbreak and humiliation, and tears pricked at her eyes and spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She did not know how long she stood there among the white camellias, weeping silently for everything she had lost, and everything she had never dared to hope she might find. But when she finally made her way back to the house, she was carrying a single bloom pressed against her heart, and she went to her private sitting room and sat in the chair by the window and stared at nothing, turning the flower over and over in her hands, trying to understand what it meant that her husband, who claimed to be incapable of love, had grown her mother's flowers in secret and never said a word. It was Mrs. Beckett who found her there, the housekeeper entering with a tea tray and stopping short at the sight of Eleanor's tear-stained face and the white camellia clutched in her fingers. And something in the older woman's expression shifted, softened, lost some of the wariness that had lingered there since Eleanor's arrival, and she set down the tray and said quietly, "He doesn't say much, the master, never has, but he notices everything. Everything, your grace. And what he notices, he remembers." Eleanor pressed her fingertips to her sternum, feeling her heart beating wild and frightened beneath her hand, and she allowed herself for the first time to wonder if perhaps there might be more to this marriage than convenience. Perhaps there might be more to her husband than she had ever dared to hope, and the camellia in her lap seemed to glow like a promise in the grey winter light. The days at Thornwood Manor had taken on a rhythm that Eleanor found herself anticipating, with a warmth she dared not examine too closely, a pattern of shared breakfasts in the morning room, where the winter light filtered pale and soft through frost-touched windows, of rides across the frozen grounds, where their breath mingled with the horses in great white clouds, and Henry pointed out the boundaries of tenant farms and the places where he had played as a boy, of evenings in the library where she curled in her chair with her Browning, and he sat across from her with estate ledgers and correspondence, the fire crackling between them and the silence no longer awkward but companionable, filled with something that felt almost like contentment. and Lady Marguerite watched them both with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction that made Eleanor's cheeks warm whenever she caught it. They talked more now than they had in those first uncertain weeks, conversations that began with practical matters and wandered into unexpected territories, and Eleanor found herself telling him about her mother's garden and the way the light had fallen through the kitchen windows of their old house, about the books she had loved as a girl and the dreams she had harbored before circumstance had taught her to dream smaller, and he listened with an attention that made her feel seen in ways she had forgotten were possible, his dark blue eyes intent upon her face, as though her words mattered, as though she mattered. And sometimes he would ask questions that revealed he had been thinking about what she had told him days or weeks before, turning her stories over in his mind like precious stones. She learned things about him too, fragments offered carefully, like gifts he was not certain would be welcome. Stories of his travels through Italy and Greece, of the books that had shaped his thinking, of the estate projects he was most proud of, though he never spoke of his childhood or his father. And she did not press, understanding that some doors remained locked for good reason. It was on an evening in late December, with snow falling soft and silent beyond the windows and the fire burning low, that Henry cleared his throat in a way that made Eleanor look up from her book, and she found him standing before her chair with a small velvet box in his hands and an expression on his face that she could not quite read. Something between determination and uncertainty that made him look younger and almost vulnerable. He explained, his voice stiffer than usual, that the box contained something that had belonged to his mother, and that he thought, that is to say, he believed, she would have wanted his wife to have it. And Eleanor opened the box with fingers that trembled slightly, and found within a bracelet of delicate silver, set with a single sapphire that caught the firelight and blazed with a blue so deep and pure that she caught her breath, because she knew that colour, knew it intimately, had seen it warming in candlelight and darkening in shadow, had watched it soften when it rested upon her face. She thanked him with a warmth she could not contain. And when he took the bracelet from the box and reached for her wrist to clasp it, his fingers brushed against her pulse point and lingered there for a moment longer than necessary, and neither of them spoke of it. But Eleanor felt the touch burning against her skin long after he had stepped back and returned to his chair, and that night in her chamber she sat before her mirror and traced the sapphire with her fingertip, and thought of camellias blooming in winter, and hands clasped in carriages, and a vow spoken with unexpected intensity. And she admitted to herself at last what she had been fighting to deny, that she was developing feelings for her husband that had nothing to do with gratitude or convenience, feelings she had sworn never to have again, and her internal promise echoed through her mind like a warning she could no longer heed, because as she watched the sapphire gleam against her wrist, the exact colour of his eyes, she knew with terrible certainty that it was already far too late. The western ball blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching the crystals of the chandeliers and scattering diamonds of brilliance across the crowded ballroom, and Eleanor moved through the glittering throng with a confidence she had not possessed 3 months ago, her hand resting lightly on Henry's arm as they navigated the sea of silk and satin and the curious gazes that followed them wherever they went. And she was aware of the sapphire bracelet warm against her wrist, aware of the way her husband's presence at her side seemed to create a space of calm amid the chaos, aware, too, of how different this felt from the last time she had attended a ball of this magnitude, when she had been alone and humiliated and certain she would never again hold her head high in society. The whispers that had once followed her with malicious delight had transformed into something else entirely, murmurs of admiration and curiosity about the Duke of Thornwood's unexpected bride, and Eleanor caught fragments as she passed, heard her own name spoken with a respect that still startled her. And she thought perhaps this was what it meant to be safe, to be protected, to belong to someone whose name alone could silence the cruelest tongues. And she glanced up at Henry's stern profile, and felt her heart turn over in her chest with an emotion she could no longer pretend was merely gratitude. Thunder rumbled distantly beyond the tall windows, a storm gathering on the horizon, and Eleanor felt a flicker of unease that had nothing to do with the weather, some premonition she could not name. And then Henry was drawn away by Lord Ashworth, an elderly earl who wished to discuss some matter of parliamentary business, and Eleanor found herself momentarily alone near the refreshment table. And that was when Theodore appeared, materializing from the crowd like a spectre from her worst nightmares, his golden hair still artfully arranged, his pale blue eyes still calculating, though she noticed now the brittleness beneath his handsome features, the desperate edge that had not been there 3 years ago when he had destroyed her with a smile and a careless word. He was adjusting his cuffs as he approached, that familiar tell she now recognized, and his smile was sharp as a blade as he murmured, "My dear Duchess, what a remarkable transformation! Who would have thought that Miss Weston of the empty coffers would rise so high? Though I confess I am curious what hidden talents you must possess to have captured such a prize. Surely Thornwood will tire of you eventually, when he realizes you have nothing to offer but middling looks and desperate gratitude." Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, felt the old wound tear open with a pain that stole her breath, and she stood frozen, unable to find her voice, unable to do anything but stare at the man who had once made her believe she was loved, and then taught her exactly how worthless she truly was. And Theodore's smile widened as he watched her distress, savoring it like fine wine, and lightning flickered beyond the windows as he leaned closer to deliver another cruelty. But then the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, and Eleanor became aware of a presence at her back, solid and immovable as a wall of granite. And Henry's voice cut through the air like a blade of ice as he said, "Lord Pemberton, I understand you once had the extraordinary poor judgment to reject my wife. I can only assume you were suffering from some deficiency of intellect, as any man with eyes and sense would recognize her worth instantly. She is the finest woman I have ever known. You, on the other hand, are a fortune-hunting parasite who traded honor for money and received exactly what you deserved, a loveless marriage and the contempt of everyone whose opinion matters. You will not speak to my wife again. You will not look at her. If I hear that you have so much as mentioned her name, I will ensure that every door in London closes to you permanently. That will be all." Theodore's face went white as parchment, and he retreated without another word, melting into the crowd that had fallen silent around them. And Eleanor turned to stare at her husband, at the cold fury carved into his features, and the blaze of something fierce and protective burning in his midnight eyes. And when he offered her his arm, his hand was trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the effort of restraining himself from doing far worse. And as thunder rolled overhead and the storm finally broke against the windows, Eleanor understood with devastating clarity that Henry had just fulfilled the vow he had made on their wedding day, that she would never again be made to feel less than she was, and something inside her shattered and reformed into a shape that felt terrifyingly like hope. The carriage swayed through the storm-lashed streets of London, rain hammering against the windows with such ferocity that Eleanor could barely see the flickering gas lamps beyond the glass, and she sat in silence across from Henry, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she struggled to comprehend what had just occurred, the echo of his words still ringing in her ears with a clarity that made her chest ache. And she watched him in the intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the interior of the carriage, watched the rigid set of his jaw, and the way his hands were clenched upon his thighs, and she understood with sudden clarity that he was still furious, that the cold devastation he had unleashed upon Theodore had not yet fully dissipated. And she realized that no one had ever defended her like that, not her gentle father, who had wept in the dark when his business crumbled, not Theodore, who had been the architect of her humiliation. No one had ever stood before the world and declared her worthy, declared her the finest woman they had ever known, and she felt tears prick at her eyes and fought them back because she did not understand, could not understand, Why this man who had married her for convenience, who had claimed himself incapable of love, would tremble with rage on her behalf. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible above the thunder. "Why did you do that? You did not have to. I have learned not to expect—" But he cut her off before she could finish, his voice rough and low as he said, "Yes, I did." And when lightning split the sky, she saw his face stark and almost pained as he continued, "I made you a vow, Eleanor. Did you think I did not mean it? He hurt you. He made you believe you were worth less than you are. I cannot abide it. I will never abide it." And the raw intensity in his voice made her press her fingertips to her sternum in that unconscious gesture she could never quite control. They arrived at the townhouse and moved through the rain-soaked entrance into the drawing-room, where a fire still burned low in the grate, and Eleanor turned to face him, the sapphire bracelet warm against her wrist, and said simply, "Thank you." But her voice broke on the words, and he crossed to her in 2 strides and took both her hands in his, bare skin against bare skin, where she had removed her gloves, his grip almost painfully tight as he said, "You never have to thank me for that, never." And they stood there with their hands clasped while rain lashed the windows, and thunder rolled overhead, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar surrounded her like an embrace, and something enormous and unspoken trembled in the air between them, something that made her heart pound against her ribs and her breath catch in her throat. Then he released her abruptly and stepped back, his voice strained as he said, "You should rest. It has been a difficult evening." And he left her standing alone in the firelit room, with her hands still warm from his grip, and the taste of hope burning on her tongue. And she knew with terrible, wonderful certainty that she was in love with her husband, that her internal promise lay shattered beyond repair, and she found she could not regret it. Eleanor and Henry returned to Thornwood Manor the morning after the ball, and something had shifted between them, something as subtle as the change in light when clouds part to reveal the sun. And yet Eleanor felt it in every glance, every accidental brush of fingers, every silence that stretched between them heavy with words neither dared to speak. And she found herself watching him with new eyes, cataloguing the small gestures she had once dismissed as mere courtesy, and recognizing them now for what they truly were. The way he ensured her tea was always prepared exactly as she liked it before she even reached the breakfast table. The way he adjusted his schedule so that he might ride with her each morning across the frost-silvered grounds. The way his gaze lingered on her face when he thought she was not looking, and she pressed her fingertips to her sternum and wondered how she had been so blind for so long. The days passed in a strange, suspended state, winter deepening around Thornwood until the gardens lay beneath a blanket of white, and the windows of the manor glittered with frost each morning, and Eleanor moved through the grand rooms with an awareness of Henry's presence that bordered on painful, her heart quickening whenever she heard his footsteps in the corridor, her breath catching whenever he entered a room, and Lady Marguerite watched them both with knowing eyes and said nothing, though her smile spoke volumes. One afternoon Mr. Aldridge sought Eleanor out in the library, where she sat curled in her usual chair with her Browning volume open in her lap, though she had not turned a page in nearly an hour, and he stood before her with an expression of quiet earnestness as he said, "I have served his Grace for 12 years, your Grace. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you, not once." And Eleanor felt her heart stutter in her chest as she asked what he meant, and Aldridge smiled gently and replied, "He watches you when you are not aware. He speaks of you when you are not present. He has become a different man since you came to Thornwood. Softer, somehow, more himself than I have seen him since we were boys together. And I thought you should know that whatever he may or may not say, his actions have already declared what his words cannot." That evening, Eleanor sat in the library as the fire crackled low and the sapphire bracelet caught the light each time she moved her wrist, and Henry entered and paused in the doorway as he always did, and she looked up and met his midnight eyes, and saw something there that made her breath stop, something raw and unguarded that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, and he crossed to his usual chair and settled across from her with his papers, and they sat in their customary silence. But it was different now, charged with possibility, trembling with everything unspoken, and Eleanor turned her gaze to the flames and allowed herself, for the first time, to hope that perhaps she was not alone in this terrifying, wonderful fall into love. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new, as though the very air at Thornwood had been subtly altered by what had passed between them in that rain-lashed drawing-room, and Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of every moment she spent in Henry's presence, cataloguing the small shifts in his demeanour that she might once have dismissed as mere courtesy, but now recognized as something far more deliberate. The way he appeared at her elbow precisely when she needed a fresh cup of tea. The way his gaze lingered on her face when she spoke, as though memorizing the shape of her words. The way his hand found the small of her back with increasing frequency when they walked together through the frost-touched gardens. And she thought of Lady Marguerite's prediction, and wondered if the older woman had seen what Eleanor herself had been too guarded to recognize. One afternoon she sat alone in the library with her mother's Browning volume open in her lap, the familiar words blurring before her eyes as her thoughts drifted inevitably to her husband, and she found herself murmuring aloud without quite meaning to, the lines falling from her lips like a confession she had not intended to make. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach. And she pressed her fingertips to her sternum, as the truth of those borrowed words settled into her bones. For she did love him with a completeness that terrified her, loved him in ways she had sworn she would never allow herself to love again, and her internal promise lay in ruins at her feet like shattered glass, and she could not bring herself to mourn its destruction. The sapphire bracelet caught the weak winter light as she turned her wrist, and she traced the stone with her fingertip, and thought of his hands clasping it around her wrist, thought of the way his fingers had lingered against her pulse, thought of the way he had looked at her in the carriage after the ball, with eyes that blazed with something far fiercer than duty, and she allowed herself to wonder whether perhaps she was not alone in this terrifying, exhilarating fall, whether perhaps the walls he had built around himself were crumbling just as surely as her own defences had crumbled, whether perhaps Lady Marguerite had been right all along, and he would speak words he had never spoken to anyone. Mrs. Beckett found her there as the afternoon light began to fade, and the housekeeper paused in the doorway with an expression of quiet satisfaction before saying, "The old Duke near broke that boy's spirit with his coldness, Your Grace. You have given him back something I thought was lost forever. This house has not felt like a home in 20 years, it does now." And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she understood that the household had witnessed what she herself was only now allowing herself to see, that Henry's transformation was not her imagination, but a truth visible to everyone who knew him. And she pressed her fingers to her sternum and allowed herself, finally, to hope. The winter deepened around Thornwood Manor, until the world beyond its frost-touched windows seemed to exist in shades of silver and white, and Eleanor moved through those crystalline days with a heart so full it ached, watching her husband with eyes that could no longer pretend indifference, cataloguing every small gesture and hoarded glance as though building a treasury of moments she might examine later in the privacy of her chamber, and she thought of her internal promise, that desperate vow she had made in the cramped drawing-room of her father's rented townhouse, when she had sworn she would not hope for love, would not be foolish again, would not give another man the power to destroy her, and she acknowledged to herself, at last, what had been true for weeks now, perhaps longer. I promised myself I would not love him. I have failed completely, and I find I cannot regret it. The admission should have terrified her, should have sent her retreating behind the careful walls she had constructed in the years since Theodore's cruelty. but instead she felt only a strange and trembling peace, as though she had been holding her breath for 3 years and had finally exhaled. She found herself seeking Henry's company with an eagerness she no longer tried to disguise, appearing in the library each evening before he arrived, and feeling her pulse quicken when his footsteps sounded in the corridor, settling into her chair with her mother's Browning volume open in her lap. Though the words blurred before her eyes because she was too aware of him across the room, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, his dark blue eyes lifting occasionally from his papers to find her watching him. One such evening, she caught him looking at her with an expression that stole her breath. Something raw and unguarded. Something that looked terrifyingly like longing. And when their eyes met, he did not look away as he once might have. Did not shutter his expression behind the cold mask he wore for the world, but held her gaze for one endless moment before his jaw tightened and he returned his attention to his papers with a concentration that seemed almost desperate. Lady Marguerite found Eleanor the next morning in the greenhouse, standing among the white camellias that bloomed impossibly in winter, the delicate scent of the flowers mingling with the humid warmth of the glass-enclosed space. And the older woman stood beside her in companionable silence before saying quietly, "He has never been good with words, my nephew. His father saw to that. But I have watched him these past months, and I have never seen him so utterly undone. He looks at you as though you are the answer to a question he did not know he was asking, and I think perhaps you look at him the same way." And Eleanor pressed her fingertips to her sternum, where her heart beat wild and hopeful against her ribs, and whispered, "I do. I look at him exactly that way. I love him, and I do not know what to do with it." And Lady Marguerite smiled with the satisfaction of a woman whose prediction was proving true, and replied, "You wait, child, you wait, and you trust, because he will come to you. He will find the words. I have watched that boy build walls for 30 years, and you are the first person I have ever seen him want to let inside." The storm announced itself with a distant rumble that Eleanor felt in her bones before she heard it with her ears, and she sat alone in the library with her mother's Browning volume open in her lap, the familiar words swimming before her eyes as the first flickers of lightning illuminated the frost-touched windows, and she thought of that night weeks ago when she had found Henry, standing at this very window, flinching at the thunder, and she pressed her fingertips to her sternum as the memory of his vulnerability mingled with the ache of her own unspoken love, and she did not hear his footsteps in the corridor, did not know he had entered until his voice, low and rough with something she could not name, said simply, "Eleanor," and she looked up to find him standing in the doorway with an expression that stole the breath from her lungs, his dark blue eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides as though he were holding himself back from something, and the lightning flashed again and illuminated the sharp planes of his face, and she saw that he was trembling, not with fear of the storm, but with the effort of containing something far more powerful. "I cannot," he began, and stopped, and crossed the room to stand before her chair, and she rose to meet him without conscious thought, the Browning volume tumbling forgotten to the floor, and he reached out and brushed a strand of chestnut hair from her face with fingers that shook, and his voice when he spoke again was barely above a whisper, stripped of all his customary coldness, raw and honest and breaking. "I told you once that I was not capable of love," he said, and thunder rolled across the sky as though the heavens themselves were listening. "I believed it, Eleanor. I believed it with every fiber of my being. My father taught me that love was weakness and vulnerability was shame and duty was the only foundation worth building upon, and I spent 30 years constructing walls so high and so thick that I thought nothing could ever breach them. And then you came into my life with your quiet dignity, and your storm-touched eyes, and your worn volume of poetry. And you sat with me during thunderstorms without mentioning my fear, and you spoke to my horse in ridiculous voices, and you wept among the camellias I grew for you, and you looked at me as though I might be something more than the cold and empty man I believed myself to be. And I—" His voice broke, and he took her hands in his, both of them bare, his grip fierce and desperate, and she felt the thin scar across his right hand beneath her fingertips, and her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. "I meant every word I spoke at our wedding, Eleanor," he continued, and the rain began to lash against the windows as the storm broke in earnest. "I have spent my life believing vows were merely obligation, but you have taught me they can be sacred. You have broken open something in me I thought was sealed forever, and I find I cannot regret it. I find I do not want to rebuild those walls. I find that I—" He stopped, and his midnight eyes searched her face with something like terror. And then he said the words she had never dared to hope she would hear, the words Lady Marguerite had predicted, the words that fulfilled every promise the universe had seemed to make and break and make again. "I love you," he said, and his voice was rough with the weight of a confession 30 years in the making. "I love you with a completeness that terrifies me. I love you in ways I did not know I was capable of loving. I love you." And here he paused, and something shifted in his expression, something almost wondering, and he quoted softly, his deep baritone wrapping around words she knew by heart. "I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death." And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized he had read her mother's book, had memorized the lines because she loved them, had been composing this confession for weeks in the silence of his guarded heart, and she pressed her fingertips to his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath her palm, and she said simply, honestly, with all the walls she had built crumbling to dust around her, "I love you too, Henry. I have loved you for longer than I knew. I promised myself I would not. I swore I would never give another man the power to destroy me. But you did not destroy me. You defended me. You saw me. You grew camellias in winter because I mentioned my mother once. You gave me a bracelet the color of your eyes and pretended it was your mother's. You—" And he made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and pulled her into his arms and held her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. And she buried her face against his chest and breathed in sandalwood and cedar and leather, and the storm raged beyond the windows. But she was safe. She was home. She was loved. The storm still raged beyond the library windows as Henry drew back just enough to look at her face, his hands rising to cup her cheeks with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and Eleanor saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. This man who had spent 30 years learning to feel nothing, now undone by the simple act of loving and being loved in return. And when he spoke her name again, it was a prayer and a promise and a question all at once. "Eleanor." And she answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his, soft at first, tentative, a question of her own. And then his arms came around her and pulled her close, and the kiss deepened into something fierce and consuming, and she tasted salt and felt the thunder of his heart against her chest, and thought that she had never known what it meant to be truly held until this moment, had never understood that safety could feel like fire and tenderness could burn. And when they finally broke apart, they were both trembling, and he pressed his forehead to hers and breathed her in and whispered, "I have wanted to do that for longer than I knew. I have wanted you for longer than I understood wanting was possible for me." And she laughed, a sound that was half sob, and replied, "I promised myself I would not love you. I built walls and told myself they would hold, and you simply walked through them as though they were not there, as though I had left the door open for you all along." And he kissed her again, slower this time, with a deliberation that spoke of patience and permanence. And when he lifted her into his arms, she did not protest, only wound her arms around his neck and buried her face in the hollow of his throat where the scent of sandalwood and cedar was strongest. And he carried her through the darkened corridors of thornwood, as lightning illuminated their path in silver flashes. And she thought of all the nights she had lain alone in her grand chamber, listening to the silence between their rooms. All the mornings she had watched him across the breakfast table and wondered what it would feel like to touch him without pretense. And now she knew. Now she was learning. And when he laid her down upon his bed and followed her there, she reached up and traced the thin scar across the back of his right hand, that childhood mark she had noticed so many times, and she pressed her lips to it and felt him shudder. And outside the storm howled and the rain lashed the windows. But inside there was only warmth, only the slide of skin against skin, and whispered words, and the slow, sweet revelation of bodies learning each other. And when at last they lay tangled together in the aftermath, her head pillowed on his chest, and his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder, she heard him say quietly into the darkness, "I did not know it could be like this. I did not know I could feel like this. I thought I was broken beyond repair, and you have proven me wrong in the most extraordinary way." And Eleanor lifted her head and looked at him, at the softness in his midnight eyes, at the way his severe features had gentled into something almost boyish. And she said simply, honestly, with all the love she had tried so hard not to feel, "You were never broken, Henry. You were only waiting, and so was I. And now we have found each other, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for this storm." The morning after the storm dawned soft and golden, the violence of the night giving way to a crystalline stillness that seemed to hold the world in gentle suspension. And Eleanor woke in Henry's arms with sunlight streaming through windows still streaked with rain, her cheek pressed against the warm solidity of his chest. And she lay there for a long moment simply breathing him in, sandalwood and cedar and leather, the scent that had become her touchstone for safety and was now inextricably woven with the memory of his hands on her skin, his voice breaking as he spoke of love, his body moving with hers as the storm raged beyond the glass. And when she stirred, he tightened his arms around her and pressed his lips to her hair and murmured her name in that low, rough voice that she now knew was reserved for her alone, and she thought that she had never in her life felt so completely, utterly at peace. They returned to London 3 days later, and if the Ton had whispered about the Duke of Thornwood's surprising marriage before, they fell into stunned silence now at the transformation they witnessed. The cold, forbidding Duke, who had terrified debutantes and their mothers for a decade now, moved through ballrooms with his wife's hand tucked possessively in the crook of his arm, his severe features softening whenever he looked at her, his midnight eyes warming to sapphire in a way that made matrons clutch their fans and young ladies sigh with envy. And Eleanor, who had once shrunk from society's scrutiny, now walked with her shoulders straight and her storm-touched eyes bright, wearing the sapphire bracelet that caught the candlelight and matched her husband's gaze, and when people looked at her, they no longer saw the merchant's daughter who had been publicly humiliated by a viscount, but the Duchess of Thornwood, beloved wife of one of the most powerful men in England, a woman who had been chosen not for her fortune or her connections, but simply, impossibly, for herself. Lady Marguerite watched them at the Aldridge ball with tears in her eyes, and whispered to Mrs. Beckett, who had accompanied them to London, that she had never seen her nephew so happy, had never believed she would live to see him smile like that. And Mrs. Beckett nodded, and said quietly that the old Duke would not have recognized his son, and thanked God for it. And across the room Eleanor caught Theodore Pemberton's eye quite by accident. He stood in a corner with Arabella, who was berating him about something, his golden looks grown brittle and desperate, his pale eyes hollow with the knowledge that he had traded love for money and received neither. And Eleanor felt no triumph, only a distant pity and an overwhelming gratitude that his cruelty had led her here, to this moment, to Henry's hand warm on the small of her back, and Henry's voice low in her ear asking if she would like to dance. And she turned to her husband and smiled the smile that transformed her face, the smile he had earned through 1,000 small kindnesses and one devastating public declaration. And she said simply, honestly, with all the love she had once sworn never to feel, "Yes, always yes, for the rest of my life, yes." And Henry's expression softened into something that made nearby observers catch their breath, and he led her onto the floor as the orchestra began to play, and they moved together as though they had been dancing all their lives, as though they had been waiting all their lives for exactly this. 5 years had passed since the storm that changed everything. 5 years since Eleanor had stood in the library at Thornwood with rain lashing the windows and her husband's voice breaking as he spoke words he had never spoken to anyone. And now she sat in that same library on a golden afternoon in late summer, the windows thrown open to admit the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass, watching her daughter Charlotte toddle across the carpet toward the chair where Henry sat with their infant son William, cradled against his chest. And Eleanor thought that if someone had told her 6 years ago, when she sat in that cramped, rented room listening to her father's labored breathing and wondering if she would survive another season of whispers and pitying glances, that she would one day know happiness so complete it sometimes frightened her, she would have laughed bitterly and turned away, because she had learned not to expect such things, had built walls around her heart and told herself they would protect her. And yet here she was, the Duchess of Thornwood, beloved wife of a man who had once claimed himself incapable of love and had proven himself capable of nothing less than devotion, so fierce and tender it still took her breath away, mother of 2 children who had inherited their father's midnight eyes and their mother's chestnut waves, mistress of a house that had become a home in ways it had not been for decades, and she pressed her fingertips to her sternum in that old familiar gesture. But now it was not to hold herself together. Now it was to contain joy so vast it seemed her heart could not possibly hold it all. Charlotte reached her father and lifted her arms imperiously, demanding to be picked up, and Henry, the formidable Duke of Thornwood, terror of ballrooms and boardrooms alike, immediately shifted William to one arm and scooped his daughter onto his knee with the other, pressing a kiss to her dark curls while she babbled something about wanting to see the baby, and Eleanor watched the way his severe features softened into something almost boyish, the way his midnight eyes warmed to sapphire, as they always did when he looked upon his family. And she remembered Lady Marguerite's prediction all those years ago, that Henry would break before he would bend, and she thought that perhaps breaking was not the right word after all. Perhaps he had simply opened, like a flower turning toward the sun after a long winter, and she had been the warmth that called him forth. The sapphire bracelet caught the afternoon light as Eleanor rose and crossed to her family, settling onto the arm of Henry's chair and leaning into his warmth, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and cedar and leather that their children would forever associate with safety and love. And Henry turned his head and pressed his lips to her temple and murmured against her skin, "I love you, Eleanor. I love you with the breath and smiles and tears of all my life," quoting the Browning she had taught him to love. And she smiled and replied simply, honestly, with all the gratitude of a woman who had weathered the storm and found herself not merely surviving but flourishing. "And I love you, Henry. I love you better today than yesterday, and I shall love you better still tomorrow." The afternoon light slanted golden through the library windows as Eleanor closed her mother's Browning volume and held it against her heart for a moment, watching her family with eyes that still marveled at the impossible abundance of her life. And she thought of the woman she had been 8 years ago, the woman who had sat in a cramped rented room with rain lashing the windows and despair pressing against her chest, who had made a promise to herself never to hope for love, never to be foolish again, never to give anyone the power to destroy her. And she wanted to reach back through time and take that woman's trembling hands and tell her that hope was not foolishness, that love was not weakness, that the very vulnerability she feared would become the door through which joy entered. And as if sensing her thoughts, Henry looked up from where Charlotte was now attempting to read to him from a picture book, while William slept peacefully in the crook of his arm, and his midnight eyes found hers across the room and warmed to sapphire in that way that still, after all these years, made her breath catch, and he smiled. Not the controlled expression he showed the world, but the soft, unguarded smile that belonged only to her and to their children. And she smiled back with all the love she had once been too afraid to feel. And Lady Marguerite's words echoed in her memory, the prediction that had seemed impossible when it was spoken, and now seemed inevitable, because Henry had broken open for her just as she had broken open for him, and in the breaking they had both become more whole than they had ever been alone. The sapphire bracelet caught the light as Eleanor rose and crossed to her family, and she thought of all the small moments that had led to this one. A bare hand covering her gloved one in a carriage, a laugh in a stable, a greenhouse full of white camellias, a vow spoken in a quiet church and fulfilled in a crowded ballroom, a confession in this very room while a storm raged beyond the windows. And she understood now that love was not a single grand gesture, but an accumulation of choices, a daily decision to show up and be seen, and trust that the other person would catch you when you fell. And Henry had caught her every single time, just as she had learned to catch him, and their children would grow up knowing what it meant to be cherished, not because they were told, but because they saw it lived out in every glance their parents exchanged, every touch, every small kindness that required no acknowledgement, because it was simply the air they breathed. Charlotte looked up as Eleanor settled onto the arm of Henry's chair and announced that she had finished reading, and would Papa please tell her again about the magnificent monster in the stables. And Henry's low laugh rumbled through the room as he promised he would take her to see Sovereign tomorrow if she was very good. And Eleanor leaned into her husband's warmth and breathed in sandalwood and cedar and leather and home. And she thought that this was what the poets meant when they wrote of love, not the desperate yearning of the early sonnets, but the quiet certainty of the final ones, the love that grew better with each passing day. And she pressed her fingertips to her sternum one last time, feeling her heart beat steady and full beneath them, and she whispered against Henry's hair words meant only for him. "I love you better today than yesterday, and I shall love you better still tomorrow." And he turned his head and kissed her softly, and murmured back, his voice rough with feeling, "Always, Eleanor, always." And outside the windows the summer afternoon stretched golden and endless, and inside the library at Thornwood Manor a family sat together in perfect contentment, and the story that had begun with a storm ended, as all the best stories do, with peace.